Hello, my name is Will McMahon. I want to welcome everybody to this Global Empty Homes Network event, which is going to be focusing on cities, mobile capital and housing vacancy. The network is a collaboration of advocates, practitioners and academics across the world who share an interest in this issue. We've been meeting for about a year, but this is our first public event. We want to reach out to others who we hope will want to collaborate with us. We thought it appropriate to hold the discussion in the week of MIPIM, which is an annual property festival that takes place in Cannes in France, and it took place on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. If you don't know what MIPIM is, I'm going to quote the London Guardian's Aditya Chakraborty, and he says, and I am quoting here, MIPIM is an event where big money developers invite town hall executives for secret discussions aboard private yachts, and whose regulars boast they get through more champagne than all the liggers at a film festival. That's straight from the London Guardian. So I can't promise you champagne, I can't promise yachts, but what I can promise is a discussion with very different priorities. If you are watching and you have a question, you'll be watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can put your question into the YouTube box or the Facebook comment box, and it will come straight to us in the studio. And I'll try and fit it in. In essence, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a three-part discussion. We're going to be looking at what was the situation across the world before the pandemic hit. We're going to be looking at how did the pandemic affect the issue of empty homes, zombie homes, vacancy? What did it do to that crisis? And then we're going to be sort of chatting about what do we think some of the policy solutions are. I'm going to take some questions from the audience and let's just see how it goes. Now, before all of that, I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam Godoy from Argentina. I am a translator in Argentina, and I am a member of Observatorio del Derecho a la Ciudad, which means Observatory of the right to the city, the right we citizens have to live and to enjoy the city. That's my introduction.
Thank you. Alan, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Alan Malik. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C., which is the leading organization in the United States focusing on empty homes and related issues, and a lecturer in the city planning program at Pratt Institute. And I'm the author of The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America, which tries to address a lot of these issues.
Rex.
Hi, I'm Rex Mckenzie. I'm an economist, an academic economist working at Kingston University in London. I was trained at the New School, and at the moment I'm doing research into wealth chain investment in British real estate. That is to say, I'm doing research on the subject of tax haven investment, money that comes through tax haven and ends up in our cities in physical structures. I'm trying to make the connections between this money, affordability, inequality, etc. That's my primary research project for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jesper.
Hello, I'm Jesper Ole Jensen. I'm from Denmark, from Aalborg University. I'm part of the institute called BUILD, which is an institute that works with urban transformation, the built environment, and urban rural migrations. I've been looking at my research, national programs to manage vacant buildings. So that's why I'm here. That's all.
Thank you very much. Carl?
Hi there, I'm the Director of Advocacy at Prosper Australia, where for over a decade we have conducted the Speculative Vacancies Report into empty housing in Melbourne. And we do that using water consumption as a proxy for vacancy. So keen to see how we can improve our measurements of vacancy.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Sam?
morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. My name is Sam Stein. I am a senior policy analyst at the Community Service Society of New York, which is an over 175-year-old organization doing research and advocacy for low-income New Yorkers. I work on housing policy and most recently led a campaign to get the state to turn empty hotels and offices into affordable housing, and hope to do more on the issue of empty homes as such.
And Andy.
Hi, I'm Andy Mosley. I'm the Senior Policy Officer for the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, and the partnership works with homeowners, local authorities, third sector organisations to understand the drive of empty homes and to support efforts to bring empty homes back into use across Scotland.
Okay, thanks very much. I should have said that I'm Director of Action on Empty Homes. I'm a relatively newbie in the field. I've only been working on it for a couple of years, but during that time I've spent time talking to experts in the room, and I've learned a lot. And this is what today's event is really about. It's about having a discussion, it's learning from each other and taking questions from people around the world. So I'm going to kick off with Carl. What time is it where you are?
It's just past 9 o'clock, just emerging from a 3-hour board meeting. So thank God I'm hanging out with you guys as we talk about something that really fires me up. Yeah, in Australia, we're sort of enduring a 20-year housing crisis. There wasn't much of a correction during the GFC. Prices keep galloping ahead. I think they're up 18.4% nationally in the last year. That's 11 times faster than wage growth. And, that seems pretty extravagant, but it's only the 13th fastest in the world. So the whole global property market has taken off during the pandemic, and record low interest rates are firing that up. And because of that, interest rates being so low, vacancy rates look like they're expanding yet again. And I'm just, you just wonder how much more people can take. And the federal government here has announced a housing supply inquiry. And of course, whenever there's a housing crisis, there's always another government inquiry, isn't there? And this one is dealing with this overarching framework that I feel best pits the MIPIN mob versus those of us who are concerned about the commodification of our communities. And so when they talk housing supply, it really is code for rezone my land and make me a millionaire yet again. But the issue is that we don't actually quantify the vacancy levels, whether they're land banks or vacant homes. And the statistics around the world on this are incredibly poor. And, as we've talked around the last year, it seems like that's by systematic design, because if we can't actually see how many vacant homes there are, people are forced into believing they need to accept this rent they're paying. And that lack of competition in the housing market really gives renters and home buyers a sense that it's a lot tighter than what it could be. So, I'm really happy to be here with everyone and hoping that we can start putting pressure on global institutions to start questioning this incredible mobility of capital. And, I often joke that investors can buy and sell a house from a hammock whilst on a beach in the Bahamas in their favorite tax haven sort of thing, It's that easy these days. And a lot of these bilateral trade agreements have been about increasing that foreign investment threshold, so people companies can just buy and sell with even less and less oversight.
So Carl, what before the pandemic kind of took hold, what was the situation like? Was it explosive? Were there a large number of empty homes appearing, or what was going on then?
Well, over the decade we've measured it, there's generally somewhere between 60 to 80,000 vacant homes. And that's about 2 to 3 times the published vacancy rate. And the vacancy rate we hear about in the press only looks at those that are advertised for rent. But if you think there's been an 18% increase in Australian property values for this year, that's the double, triple the rent you could make. So why bother renting it out? Let's leave it empty.
Yeah.
But in 18-19, there was actually a bit of a correction. But of course, that only barely lasts a year. And then there's more policy fraud enacted, more stimulus for property investment. Because really, the Western economies have hollowed out their economy. We don't manufacture much anymore, so it's all about housing construction.
And okay, so can I ask somebody from Alan? What does it look like from where you're sitting?
The United States has a very unusual set of dynamics. In terms of mobile capital, there are a few places in the United States where I think you're seeing major capital investment triggering empty homes. But I would say those are limited to a relatively few very hot markets, particularly New York, California, coastal cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, probably Miami, perhaps. When you get away from the coasts, you have a totally different dynamic, which is the absence of capital. And massive disinvestment in the hearts of cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Baltimore, even some coastal cities. And then you have anomalies like Chicago, where there are parts of Chicago where you're seeing infusions of outside capital and the empty homes triggered by that. And only a few miles away, massive disinvestment and loss of capital and empty homes because of absence of capital, discrimination, market failure, and a whole host of things. So it's a very, you might call it a bipolar picture. And I don't think it's been changed significantly by the pandemic. What has happened in the pandemic is a huge rush of property acquisition in particularly in suburban and exurban and outer ring areas, if you will, around metropolitan cities. So, for example, in New York, you've had a decline in property values to some extent, I think, in Manhattan. I think it's temporary. I don't think it's a long-term shift. But then you've had amazing increases in property values and demand for housing. For example, in the Hudson Valley, in the Catskills, in areas that are, say, 2 and 3 hours from New York. Similarly, the temporary declines in property values in San Francisco, explosion in property values in places like Boise, Idaho, which is, again, not that far. So it's a very bipolar picture. And I think one point to this goes to, a larger issue. We've had an undersupply of housing production relative to demand for at least the last decade. We have the demand for housing, the household growth and so forth has outpaced housing production. So we've had a kind of a creeping housing shortage gradually build up over the last decade. And now with the pandemic, with the increasing demand, with the decline in available inventory, we've seen an explosion.
All right, that's okay.
Can I say something here?
Yes, you can. I've just had a request from we've got people watching us, and if you can go on mute while you're not speaking, because people are getting an echo. Rex.
Yeah, I just want to make a point in relation to what Alan has just said, or 2 points. Firstly, and perhaps very importantly, and this is about a British situation as opposed to the American situation, our housing problem has often been cast as an undersupply of housing. I want to make a small differentiation. I think what we have in Britain is an undersupply of affordable housing as opposed to housing in general. I've seen work from the Bank of England that suggests this, and work from people at UCL that also suggest that that's what we we have, and a guy called Mulherin has written a quite influential paper on the subject. The other thing I'd like to say is that we observe the same kind of bipolarity in housing prices, in housing, in empty homes, etc., in the same way that Alan has observed in the United States. I've done work, or we have done work on both London and on Liverpool, and deliberately so. One, because it's an affluent global city, the other one because it's, if you like, a second-tier city. And we're seeing where money rushes to the center of, say, Liverpool, but then the other areas of Merseyside are pretty much ignored. Now, my explanation for that is that the money is going where the services are. Okay, so if you know that there are services in this area, then it's good for investment. And if there are no services, say in Knowsley, St. Helens and other places, then it's virtually ignored. One correlation that we've noted is that, say, in Kensington and Chelsea, which is the richest borough in England and perhaps in Europe, is that there are a surprising number of empty homes as well.
Okay, so can I just take us somewhere, because the bipolarization thing I think is really, really interesting in one aspect of the discussion. There's another kind of aspect of the discussion which is around depopulation, I think is one way of thinking about it. And I kind of wanted to bring Jesper in on this to talk about what might be happening in Denmark and looking at it from a slightly different perspective, maybe. Jesper?
Yeah, it's true that the vacancy that we see here in Denmark is mainly related to depopulation of peripheral regions. Not only people moving to the larger cities and creating a large call for new buildings there. So the major cities in Denmark, like Copenhagen, Aarhus, Aalborg, struggling with finding places for building new homes for new inhabitants, while the regions in the periphery are facing vacant houses, houses that goes out of the market. And these are primarily single-family homes, old farm buildings, and it's not only it's people out migration, but it's also people simply dying out there, and nobody to move in. Mm-hmm. And then you can ask yourself, is this a big problem that we have vacant houses there? One point of view is that, well, the vacant houses causes the scares potential buyers away, because who wants to live with a vacant house as a neighbor? And there's some perceptions of vacant houses being part of the problem with no people moving to the periphery. Another, and I think more critical problem for the municipalities, the local authorities out there, is that we see speculative renting of these vacant properties. Mm-hmm. Investors or small scale investors, you can call it that buys these properties, which are often in very poor conditions, and they rent them out to people who are getting displaced from the larger cities. They can't afford to live there anymore, but they can afford to live in a very cheap, affordable, but poorly maintained house in the peripheries. And that movement of people with low of resources moving to the peripheries really causes problem for those local authorities, because they have to take care of health and unemployment of these people here, have to help them along. And that really stresses the municipal budget. So this is a big issue for those municipalities to avoid these vacant buildings. Although we have, although we have official programs, national programs on removing those vacant properties, and this problem of speculative renting is not officially part of the agenda, but everybody knows that it is really for those involved in it. So we have these programs, I think, as one of the few countries in Europe, and that's a good thing. But we have looked into all kind of, how are these budgets managed locally by the municipalities, and there's a lot of things to be said about that. So, but that's the overall situation here, I would say.
Okay, all right, and somebody else I've spoken to about depopulation, Andy from Scotland. What's the picture there?
Yeah, well, I think in Scotland we've it's back to that sort of bipolar nature of it that Alan and Rex mentioned. So we've got depopulation in a lot of areas. The Scottish Government recently published Housing to 2040, which has a sort of a specific commitment there to look at issues around repopulation, sustaining fragile communities over the kind of 20-year period. At the same time, we also have the issue around affordable housing. The same as Rex mentioned, if we look at the sort of the larger cities, we're not necessarily seeing increased levels of vacancy. We know in areas such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's high levels of vacant stock. But what we're seeing more, I think, is as mobile capital comes in, it's driving up increasingly rent levels for new homes. It's making affordable accommodation harder to come by, making it harder for people to buy property. So we're seeing how that's kind of twisting the market and really pushing the prices up higher. Whilst in other parts of the country, we can see potentially evidence of sort of vulture funds coming in areas where there has been market failure, potentially funds coming in, buying in the hope of an eventual upturn in the market. So we've got all of these different factors going on, as well as the issues that Jesper mentioned again around depopulation in many of the rural areas.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. And Miriam, what's the picture in Argentina?
Well, the picture in Argentina was before the pandemic. We were already in the middle of a big crisis because we had a government that left us a huge debt, a huge foreign debt that grew during that government. Before that, we had 47 or 50% of debt over GDP. But with that government, we had a debt with the IMF for $57,000 million, and the foreign debt grew during that government by $100,000 million. This is terrible. We were already in the middle of a crisis. We had a crisis in 2019 when the first step of elections showed that the government in that moment was going to change. And the dollar went up. Oh, okay, no? It was terrible. The new government took office in December 2019. And in March, we were already in the pandemic. So we had a crisis and a crisis over a crisis. And we are a country of crisis history. We have crisis every 8 years or so. We had neoliberal governments in the dictatorship in the 90s and the last government from 2015 to 2019. And those governments make decisions that favor capital flight. Mm-hmm. It is said that we have a debt of 300,000 million, and there is capital of Argentine people abroad for the same amount. So,
right. So you've got capital flight rather than mobile capital coming in, or do you have mobile capital coming in as well?
Capital flight. We have capital
Okay.
flight. And now
Okay.
we had a pandemic. The government took a lot of measures to help people. For example, evictions were forbidden because we have a growing number of population becoming tenants and not being able to become owners of their own homes.
Mhm.
So in the pandemic, people could not pay the rents, so there was a decree from the government to avoid evictions. And to help people, there were also a lot of plans to give housing. But there was a law that was passed that helps those people having sent capital abroad to invest in the construction of buildings, of houses. But this is not good because this is like helping people launder money and legally, because those are the same capitals that were sent abroad, and now they can invest them here without paying this tax and that tax and lots of taxes. Okay. And this is not good for helping that housing is built for good purposes, because they are going to invest in those people who can buy very luxury, expensive homes. So the problem of lack of houses for the middle class is not going to be solved at all. And we were not waiting this from a government like this one, which is a more popular government, but they failed in doing this.
Okay. If and you know, I remember maybe 2 decades ago when Argentina just simply said, we're not paying our debt.
No.
And that had a very dramatic effect, I seem to remember. But Sam, what's the situation from where you are, and how do you think that the pandemic has impacted on empty homes and vacancies and zombie homes?
Right. So I'm coming from the New York City context, and Alan was talking about the bifurcated market. New York City is one of these places that is hyper-capitalized in its real estate market and its housing market. And as a result, we have a great deal of vacant housing, mostly of two types that I'm most concerned with. And this was the case before the pandemic. There is the classic kind of high visibility type, which is newly built luxury high rises whose apartments are bought and sold as investments, never to be used. There was a survey of New York City housing that's done every 3 or 4 years. The last one was 2017. It found that we had almost 250,000 built but unoccupied or underoccupied housing of that type. It's the plurality of unused housing in New York City. So that's huge. There's 3.5 million units of housing, period. 250,000 are of that type of vacant. But there's another kind of vacant that's very important. That's actually a landlord strategy in lower income housing. Tenants won a very important victory in 2019, strengthening our rent control laws. And one tactic that some landlords have taken is to purposefully leave empty apartments in the hopes that they can combine 2 units into one. So shrinking the stock of affordable housing. And when they do such combinations, they can set the new rent at market rate. We call this Frankensteining units, combining 2 dead units into one. So these are 2 very different kind of strategies, but they both have to do with the hyper intensity of real estate in New York City, and mobile capital sort of exponentially increases the pace of sales and the rate of increase in the value of these homes, including the empty ones. In terms of the pandemic, Alan also mentioned that Manhattan property markets took a hit, which is true overall, was especially true in luxury housing, as those were the folks who had the means to move to the Hudson Valley and the other places in the immediate surrounding area. But also we had some record property sales of condo buildings and condo units. So the rich are still treating New York City as a place to park, grow, and hide money. And the pandemic doesn't seem to have ended that.
All right. Okay. I mean, in terms of London, we had lots of people saying, well, there's going to be a property crisis. Yeah. And what we had was basically people moving. A lot of people started to buy outside of London. So what we've seen is an escalation in property prices and more money flooding in. And it sounds like you're having a very similar effect there. And it's almost as if the pandemic hasn't really, it's almost as if it made it stutter and then accelerate. Is that other people's experience?
I think that one thing that we should consider in association with the pandemic is what private equity has been doing, and what big financial interests have been doing in the period. Now, I think last month at some stage there was a newspaper story about Lloyds Bank, who intends to be the biggest landlord in Britain in 5 years, 10 years, I don't know how long. But that's actually concrete. And they have observed the profitability of renting property in this country, and they have a whole strategy around how they will cash in on this. Similarly, private equity firms, the usual suspects, have been buying up specific properties in the major cities as well. So I think there's this big financial interest on one side. You've got the state or local councils on the other side, and I think Carl has spoken to this, and Miriam to some extent has spoken to this. But the role of the local councils is really important. We have had these years of austerity where the local councils have been strapped for money, and they are now thinking that they need to be innovative in how they raise money. And these are all kind of, well, not all, but a great proportion of them are like partnerships with developers, big business, etc., their own companies who mirror the practices of the financial interests and so forth and so on. So one doesn't blame the councils, but at the same time, it is kind of a departure from the kind of urban managerialism that we were used to in the 70s and perhaps the 80s. So the situation is changing in a really pronounced manner. And it really speaks, I don't know about the Lloyds situation, but, the first impact on ordinary people is affordability. And the second impact is the gentrification of particular neighborhoods, which pushes the original residents to the edges and completely changes the face of the neighborhoods. And these are important aspects of the whole jigsaw that we need to be thinking about. But just one further point. What strikes me, I go back to Kensington and Chelsea, the richest borough in Europe, and you've got a high proportion of empty homes in the same borough, and you've got Grenfell in the same borough. So it's this. I like Alan's phrase, bipolarity. You've got these bipolarities kind of immediately, and they smack you in the face.
Yeah. I think. Yeah. What's interesting in the United States is, again, there has been this increase in property markets and pandemic buying and so forth, there has also been, I think, some increase in investor buying. There's been there's been a slight uptick. I think some papers have presented this as a dramatic shift, which it really is not. But there has been an uptick. And one thing that's important is capital is extremely inexpensive in the United States at this point. Mm-hmm. You have home mortgages for well below 3%, and investors can access capital in some cases in the market at even less than that. So the cost of getting into the property market has become incredibly cheap. And one thing that's interesting is you start to see investors, medium-sized to large investors, starting to buy property in areas that they would never have bought 5 or 10 years ago. Not though for purposes of holding as empties, but for purposes of rental. Because when you can buy inexpensive properties with 2% money, you can rent them they're not affordable to low-income people, but low-end rates, if you will, and still make money and hope for some appreciation down the road. So there has definitely been a shift, not so much in terms of the empty home issue as in terms of investment in the rental market. The other thing that's interesting is that despite the fact that I think in a few decades it will probably be uninhabitable, there still is a massive investment in property and price appreciation and demand in the American Sun Belt, in places like Nevada, like Arizona, California, Texas, and so forth. And these are the areas which are seeing the greatest amount of investment after the hot coastal markets like New York City.
And is this mobile capital buying up lots and lots of different rental properties, or is it, what's going on there?
It's a very mixed bag.
Wow.
You still have a lot of small investors in the market, taking advantage of some money, some low interest rates and so forth. You do have large investors, large institutional investors, corporate investors. Mostly they're domestic entities, so where the money initially comes from, Lord only knows. But these people are starting to represent a not insignificant share of the property market in a few markets like Atlanta, perhaps Phoenix and so forth, but not nationally. And then there still is mobile capital, again, mm-hmm. not in the sense of massive institutional corporate, but for example, there's a great deal of Chinese investment in places like Las Vegas and California, buying mm-hmm. houses, again, not for themselves, not to hold empty, but as rental investments or as hedges against instability in China. You see the same thing with respect to Latin American investment in places like Miami.
Right.
So there's definitely, but it's a big country. So there are a lot of different dynamics, of regional dynamics.
If I could just say something real quick, Alan said, alluded to this briefly, but it's kind of terrifying that some of these places may be uninhabitable in a couple decades. And I just wanted to note the implicit climate denialism involved in some of these real estate strategies. We tend to think of climate denialism as something else, but building massive new investments in either sinking or burning land is another form of climate denial.
Yeah, Andy and then Miriam. Andy.
You have to see, sorry.
So picking up on some of the things Alan said, we're looking at kind of small investors. One of the things we saw in Scotland a couple of years ago was almost front-loading investment packages. So for want of a better term, perhaps dodgy investment companies, encouraging investors to put money in to build up a property portfolio with the idea of, here's the property that looks good, and you'll buy a lot of other ones as well. And the other ones were generally in areas where they couldn't be rented out, where they did need a lot of work doing on it, and people really, I think, sort of putting their investment money, their savings, into almost equivalent to Ponzi schemes in terms of the property that they were getting. So there's a lot of that kind of almost sort of malicious investment strategies that some companies are doing, I think.
Okay, Miriam.
No, I wanted to say that you have to see the climate central map to see where, which are the places, what are the places that will be flooded in the next years. And we have in Buenos Aires now a problem because there is the government and a big company want to build towers 145 meters tall, 50 floors, in a place that is a wetland in the coast. The land itself was public, was because it is the coast and it should be public, and it was public. The national government lost it, giving it away with the law when it should have recovered it from a kind of donation it had been given years ago, and then it was in the market, and it was bought by a company who now wants to build those buildings 145 meters, 900,000 square meters. It's a big it's a big land, and because of this idea of capital flight, of living in dollars in Argentina, because if you want to buy a home, you have to pay it in dollars, in notes. And if you want to know how much is a home, your mind is already in dollars. Your mind is already in dollars. You cannot think it in pesos. From the crisis in the 70s, we had that change in our minds and in our market, and all homes and houses are bought and sold in dollars.
You have a dollarized housing market, yeah?
Yes, a dollarization of the housing market.
Okay.
And the idea behind building those luxury homes, the entrepreneur himself says, is saving money in bricks, because you may save it in the stock exchange, but if it is very unstable, you can save your money in bricks. And what happens? We already have a luxury neighborhood called Puerto Madero, but they have almost between 50 to 75% of those homes, luxury homes, vacant. And the plan of this new neighborhood is very near from Puerto Madero, and it's the same idea. Luxury homes to save money in bricks. Nothing of this will go to people who cannot have access. A young man said in a public audience, I have to work 104 years to be able to buy a 2-room apartment in Puerto Madero.
Yeah,
And
that's just crazy, isn't it? I mean, we've had a question in from somebody who's called themselves Fast Crafts, actually, and I think they're talking about small buyers as well as the environmental stuff. They say, Carl, is this situation similar in Australia? Do they sell off your public land to private developers?
Yeah, there is quite a bit of that sort of short-term thinking where public lands are sold off to developers. It is frustrating for us because we'd love to see things such as community land trusts established that have an affordable housing focus. And part of the problem we have when properties like that are put on the market is big capital can come in and outbid those sort of social ventures. So we lose the opportunity for some diversity within these inner city suburbs, and that is a concern. But one of the points I wanted to raise is we're talking mobile capital, and when we talk about vacancy, the Murdoch press in particular loves demonizing foreign investors, and they blame the whole game on foreign investors. But really, that in a way is a cover story, a deflection from the fact that foreign investors are barely 10% of the market. And it's really domestic investors, old money, that are playing the age-old land game that wins. So, yeah, when we're talking mobile capital, there is, this frustration that we've had 20 years of housing crisis, but here in Australia, governments have fallen into line, believing the property lobbies who have taken over the statistics to produce these vacancy stats. Crazy the government allowed that, but they've used this housing supply crisis as an excuse to now get to bring in Wall Street, to bring in big capital to engage in this corporatization of the rental market that's sweeping through the Northern Hemisphere, these rental-backed mortgage securities that are coming through. And, it really scares me what's happening with prop tech and, the sort of big brother on your phone in a way, helping these big private equity companies calculate exactly how much rent you can pay. So the future of housing is a challenge, and governments listening to their mates who fund their campaigns, this link back to the sanctity of a property owning democracy. It has to be questioned, this term of landism rather than capitalism. It seems that the West is heading further and further down that path, and we need to come up with a model where some sort of mixed economy can occur, where we can balance out these market powers, these incredible advantages of owning location, and seeing it rise in value as better and better community development makes those places more attractive.
I'm going to pick. Rex, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
I just want to caution. Again, first talking about the West. I think we should speak about Anglo-Saxon countries, separate and distinct from places like Germany, who have a different kind of housing policy. Let me also say this. I think a lot of what we've been talking about is connected with what, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, with what Brett Christophers calls rentierism. And this is this move away from the production of goods and services to kind of rent as, the major way to earn profits. And so we've seen, for instance, if we look at our manufacturing industry, we have no more manufacturing industry to speak of. The coal mines are all gone, etc., etc. And so increasingly more and more in different spheres, in tech, but particularly in land, particularly in housing, there's this thrust to making money via rent. The other thing about that I'd like to say is I think all capital is mobile capital these days. Perhaps the most mobile of capital is the big business capital. And in the case of Britain, in my research, I'm observing two things. I'm seeing big capital coming in from a center like Luxembourg. This has been in Ireland, you can trace it through, and it comes in via Luxembourg, and it ends up in kind of very select areas of the country. And then you're seeing through places like the Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, smaller amounts of capital coming in, with smaller investors ending up in places like Liverpool. Now, I can't get behind the numbers, and the data is sparse. But what I'm thinking is that these smaller bits of capital may actually be Brits So not foreign investors as such, but actually Brits who are buying second homes using these particular vehicles. I don't know, it's a speculation.
Yeah.
And one of the difficulties working in the area is that data is very difficult to come by.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thinking that we have at Action on Empty Homes as well, Rex, is that may be the issue. Can I just bring Jesper in terms of big capital, smaller investors? What does it look like in where you are?
There's a lot of inflow from foreign capital. There's no doubt about that, and they've discovered the Danish property market. I think the biggest issue we've had here in recent years, and that relates a bit to the discussion about foreign versus domestic investors, is that the Blackstone the thing that was running here made a big issue in political ways. Where Blackstone bought up a lot of properties, and due to regulation in the rent control, if you invest a certain amount of money in the properties, you can raise the rent level, right? So you get rid of the rent control, so to say. And this issue, or this law has been in place for like 25 years, and it was made to attract domestic investors to improve properties, and it has worked. It has been Danish pension funds who has been using this way to get good investment or good paybacks for investment, and to raise the level of the property market. But I think Blackstone was extremely clumsy and greedy, and it ended up with a regulation about that. So they, I think it's true what was said. Also, it's a small proportion of the total market that Blackstone has been involved in, but nevertheless, it caused a regulation of the whole entire market there. Although Danish investors had been doing this business for 2 decades, so it's. Yeah, so that I think that has been the main issue around here. But I don't think that it doesn't really relate to the vacancy problem here. I would say it's more like the affordability question, of course.
Okay. Well, we I mean, in the UK or in England, I mean, Andy, you can speak for Scotland, I'm sure, but in England we seem to have had 2 things going on: lots of investment coming in, lots of stuff going up, and empty numbers going up as well. So it almost feels like the investment is driving the emptiness. We have approximately 250,000 long-term empty homes. That's been going up 20% in the last 3 years. We've also been looking at the second home market, which are empty properties, actually, and there's another 250,000 there. So we're verging on 500,000 plus properties which are empty in a market where prices are going up. And we seem to have a relationship between those 2 things, which is kind of really worrying. And, you know, my thoughts turn to, you know, what might we be able to do with what we're seeing? What policy options exist? I think there's a question has come in from Bridget in Shropshire. She's asking which countries or cities around the world have implemented the most effective policies to reduce empty homes numbers and vacancy and combat Airbnb and that kind of mobile investment. Well, who's doing it best? Who's tackling it best? Is anybody tackling it best?
I know kind of what Barcelona, there's been a lot of examples about what Barcelona have been attempting to do to deal with vacant properties owned by corporations and taking those on, giving those out, using those as a sort of social rent. It's always then harder to find out what's actually happened to the initiatives in Barcelona. There's a lot of talk each time around of when something's being done. It gets harder to find out whether it's materialized. And I think a couple of things have been kind of shot down by various opponents along the way, but they seem to be doing a lot to really try to tackle the issues there, I think.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about that? About actions?
Yeah.
Carl?
Yeah, certainly. Well, Vancouver's the one who gets a lot of plaudits on this. They have a 1% vacancy tax backed up by a $10,000 a day potential fine if you are busted for not self-declaring your property. and vacancy rates have fallen there. They release an annual report on it. They ensure that the revenue raised is hypothesized to more affordable housing. So they've got the public on board. They did a really good outreach program. Probably the opposite end of the spectrum to that is what's happening here in my hometown in Melbourne, where we lobbied for years for some sort of holding charge. Ultimately, would love a higher land tax, but they chose a vacancy tax, and that was also a 1% rate, but they had very little oversight. The fines were minimal. They didn't publish openly how much revenue they were raising, and on our numbers, they should have been raising close to $500,000, but instead they were, $500 million, but they were pulling in about $6 million. So yeah, property owners here have taken a laugh on it, and really not much is happening on that front. But yeah, there needs to be a lot more investigation of this, because as this the returns, the speculative returns in property continue to rise, and we're seeing such extortionate increases in property, the motivation to hold them vacant continues. So we need other policy levers.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, I can't say that I have an example of somebody that's succeeding, but a couple of efforts at least. There's been a proliferation of what are known as vacant property registration ordinances in the United States. One organization that tracks these estimates there are now over 1,700. And these typically require that the property be registered, that the owner maintain the property, hold insurance, and many of them have graduated annual fees, which increase in some cases quite significantly with every year that the property has not yet been put back into use and occupancy. But so on paper, this seems like a very significant initiative. In practice, when I've looked at it, is very few cities have made a serious effort to make sure that properties are in fact registered, or to collect the fees, or to have effective programs to put the properties back into use. I think Baltimore has had a fairly effective program using a form of legal receivership, where they actually take the owners to court, and if the owners don't agree to restore the property, the court actually takes title from them and passes it through to an entity that's willing to do that. And they've actually been able to restore a few thousand properties. But again, there's virtually no public money available to support it, so it only works where the market is at least minimally strong enough to support the physical rehabilitation of the property. So that, and generally speaking, a lot of the properties do end up in the hands of investors who rent out the properties. Hopefully they're responsible ones, but still, it raises some questions about the long-term outcomes. Washington, D.C. has instituted a vacancy tax, where vacant properties are now taxed at 3 times the regular residential property tax rate. And if they've been determined to be blighted, then they're taxed at 6 times the residential property rate. But I haven't seen any data yet on how effective that's actually been to bring properties back into use. So there's a lot of activity, but it's hard to see what results it's generating.
I'll chime in quickly.
Go ahead,
Rex. Okay.
Go ahead, Sam.
Quickly, New York City has not had a great deal of success on the warehousing and vacancy front, but we have had some success in going after exploitive use of Airbnb. And I think it's worth highlighting that the reason we've been able to do that is an overlap in interest between the tenant movement and the labor movement, with a very politically powerful hotel workers union seeing Airbnb as just as much of a threat as the tenant movement, which is seeing affordable units sort of taken out of the market and used as Airbnb. So that combination of labor and tenant advocacy does not always work, but has in that case, and maybe a model for elsewhere.
I think that's a really good thing to report. Actually, we have a day of action coming on October the 9th, where we have labour movement organisations involved and campaigners, and that is a really good example of the kind of thing that should be done. I mean, we got 80,000 plus short lets in London minimum. I mean, it's phenomenal what's going on there. So that's a really interesting example. I want to Rex and then Carl.
I'll be very quick. In general terms, in terms of policy, you're talking about the state assuming a greater role as a landlord, as perhaps in Singapore. However, if that is kind of like trying to roll back the last 40 years of neoliberalism, but that in general terms, that's what it means.
Okay, and Carl?
The Airbnb question, I noticed that one. Yeah, I've came across some recent evidence talking about one of our cities here, Hobart, having a concentration of 12% Airbnb to long-term rentals. And that density of Airbnbs being one of the highest in the world. And I've been interested in looking at a cap on dedicated Airbnbs as a percentage of rental bonds lodged with the government. And the suggestion by one of Australia's leading research outfits, Uhuri, was that that cap is run at about 5% of long-term rentals. And I just wondered what our panel thought about that. Have they seen any sort of evidence or thinking about how on earth some cities, New York, have limited the number of days they can be rented out, I think. There's a number of policies there, but it's certainly having an effect on the rental supply. So yeah, we need some answers. What are you guys seeing?
Yeah, are there other examples?
Again, I think one of the things that Scottish government are looking at tackling as to what can be done with Airbnbs and second home markets in terms of whether you can provide local limits, giving local authorities the ability to kind of limit the numbers that are coming in. The counter side of that, I think, is where we see the unregulated Airbnbs, this gap between what's sort of is officially classed as Airbnb and the number of properties that you can see advertised in Edinburgh, which suggests that there's a lot going on that is being classed as something else. And I think it's interesting. I think was you, Alan, who was talking about also, or Samuel, who was talking about the crackdown in New York on Airbnbs. And I'd be very interested in knowing more about that as to how that happened and how that might be something that could be replicated, certainly in parts of Scotland.
Yeah.
We had made contact with Empty Homes because we want to write a draft of the law for vacant homes in Buenos Aires, where we don't have, and we have some related laws in other jurisdictions, but not in Buenos Aires. And another point is changing the mind in people that housing is a human right, should be a human right, and should be a public service, like, for example, education or public health. If society changes its mind, it may help towards passing new laws that consider that no one has to be left behind.
Yeah. I mean, that's very much what we're aiming to drive in the UK, and we're more than happy to help you with that. I'm sure others will be, on the law that you're driving. It's great that you got in touch. Jesper, have you any examples that might give us hope? And then I've got a general question that's come in from Frank in Spain.
Were you talking about vacancy or the Airbnb? I didn't get that.
Where you're talking about policy initiatives to tackle vacancy.
Yeah, as I wrote in the chat, that we've got this occupation obligation that you're not allowed to if you own property where you don't live yourself, you're obliged to rent it out. And I think that actually works but it has avoided that especially in Copenhagen, that you see investments that where owners leave it empty and so on. But but the opposite, of course, is tempting for the municipalities with without migration, because they can decide that it's possible to live there and use it as second homes. The homes there. To attract at least some investments, there, and it's a big issue whether it's a good idea to use it there. So, but I think the obligation works actually in the bigger cities. And someone asked about what if they don't comply? What then? I'm not quite sure, but what tools the municipalities have, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, well, you make it sound remarkably simple. It sounds really simple, actually.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is it monitored? I guess is what I'm saying. Is do people monitor it? Is it?
Yeah.
Is the law enforced?
It's the local municipalities who are enforcing it. They can decide it, and I think they do follow it. But I'm not. Okay. I'm as I said, I'm not really sure what can they do if they don't comply. Those places here. So I have to owe you an answer for that. So
okay, that's really interesting, actually. Frank has come in with a question which is kind of quite high level, which is saying, following the Biden administration's work to gain international agreement on a minimum global tax level for transnationals, do you think there's any chance of similar global agreements to take action on vacancy? Or are we miles away from that? What do people think?
Miles away.
That's a 2-word answer. Does everybody agree with that? Or okay, that's
I love the thinking of it, though, because we've seen these campaign tools, climate, we've seen against fracking, we've got a big lock the gate movement. But here in Australia, we've had our first municipal declaration of a key worker housing crisis. And, until we start to build up that sort of campaign angle, that this is really, such a primal issue that it has to be dealt with, and build up from there and there to that sort of institutional level. It is a way away, but the pain people are feeling out there is immense. So perhaps it's closer than we think it is. That sort of catching on.
Yeah, I saw somebody's lips move then, but I didn't. Was that you, Sam, or was it Alan?
Yeah. Well, just quickly, I think part of the problem is, I think the pressure in the United States at a national level is really being felt around the issue of affordability and availability of housing to low-income people, just working class, middle class people. Even though it varies regionally, this is the issue that's rising to the top. The issue of vacancies is an enormous issue at the local level in certain parts of the country, but it hasn't been treated as a national issue, and at no point has it. And I don't see that really changing in the immediate future. So,
yeah, no, it's an interesting comment. I mean, in England and Wales, it's an emerging issue, I think we would say. And then we've got a day of action on October the 9th where people are focused on emptiness during the COVID crisis, where people need a place to live, and the housing emergency. And now we've got now we have the Afghan refugee crisis. We're going to make sure that the kind of message out there is there's a lot of empty properties here. So 20,000 Afghan refugees coming to the UK ain't that much. We can handle it. Yeah. And so we're going to be talking about all those kinds of things in our day of action and with the coalition that we've built. And also we're making connections with people who live in what we call desirable coastal areas, where people are finding it impossible to rent places because investors are buying all the desirable places up. And we're trying to connect people in London and urban areas who are facing expense and emptiness and Airbnb with people in coastal areas who are facing exactly the same problem and saying, look, you might think you're different, but you've got the same interests here. And that's kind of how we're doing it. And the hotel workers stuff, Sam, is a great tip, actually. It's a really interesting way of focusing the problem.
Just with the affordable housing point, Alan, I think what we're seeing in Scotland as well, the arguments have always been the issue about getting more affordable housing. And we're seeing the Scottish Government now giving a commitment to 110,000 new affordable homes over the next 10 years. But what we're not necessarily seeing is them kind of joining up the dots, because these are always coming in as we're going to building new build properties. We know across Scotland we've got 47,000 long-term empty homes, another 44,000 that are vacant properties, which to all intents and purposes, again, you think, well, they're still long-term empty. You add those numbers up, they're not all in the right locations, but there's a sizable amount. And it's sort of, if people, we need to sort of try to get people joining the dots up and thinking these homes have to be brought back into use. Because it's also, I think, when we look at environmental issues, building 110,000 new homes has a great carbon cost on it. Bringing 110,000 homes back into use, you've got less bricks and mortar going into that. It's a better way to be tackling the issues.
Yeah, Andy, you took some of my summary, because I was there, and thank you for doing that. No, that's great. It's great, because I was about to mention the fact that, I'm actually going to have to bring it to a close now. We've run out of time, which is a real shame. But I want to thank everybody who's participated today from across the world. I particularly want to thank people from the United States and Argentina who got up very early in the morning to take part in this. It was really good, and for the people who brought questions to the table, that was great as well. Just a heads up, if you want to find any more about the Global Empty Homes Network, you can go to the Action on Empty Homes website, and we have a page there, and you can get in touch with us there. And we're going to move to set up a website of its own in the future, but get in touch with us. We will be having an event for COP26 Fringe at the end of September on retrofitting, because one of the things we're arguing is that retrofit, empty homes can lead the retrofit revolution. If the government gives local communities the money to do it, then it can have an impact, and you can put all these houses back into use at a much lower carbon cost than as Andy was talking about. So thanks to our panelists. If you're interested in the Global Empty Homes Network, do get in touch. We will be holding more events. It's been a great discussion, and there are other issues that we need to touch on in the year to come, so we'll be doing some more events like this. And thank you, and goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.